We are a people of creativity. I think it's something that Ralph Waldo Emerson would say if he were here today, that we are definitely a people of creativity. And that last reading where he said that what prevents us from being creative livers or living creatively, fear of public opinion, and undue reverence for one's own consistency, I think we've taken it to heart. So let me tell you why. First, I'm going to talk about our creative theology, and our creative spirituality will follow after that. So, brief history lesson. I know a lot of you, if not the majority of you, are come-inners. You weren't raised Unitarian Universalists, so there seems to always be a little bit of a need to help refresh our history. So, our theological history dates back to the origins of Christianity, actually. So back then, there was this big argument between Trinitarian and Unitarian theology. All right, what's that? Those are big words. Trinitarian, if you came from a Christian tradition, you probably know it. You know the term, the Trinity, but you maybe don't remember what it is. It's this whole concept that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit were one in the same, but yet separate being. Well, from the very, very beginning, we were a contentious lot and decided that that's not true, and that's probably not even biblically based. And so in the Council of Nicaea, which sounds really fancy, it's in the 4th century, the emperor of Rome decided that you can't have all these different Christian communities thinking different things throughout the empire. You all have to believe the same thing. So he called a council in the city of Nicaea. And everybody came and they debated for an entire year on the nature of Jesus and all the things that we know in Christianity today. Those of you that probably came from Christian backgrounds remember something called the Nicene Creed. And you said, I believe this, that, and the other thing. That's where this come from. Well, back then, we were represented. There was this monk named Arius who came from Alexandria, Egypt. And back then, Alexandria rivaled Rome in importance in the Mediterranean. And there was a lot of fervent Christians there. And they believed that Jesus was a great person and probably maybe divine, but not the same as God. So Arius went to the Council of Nicaea, stated his case, and obviously didn't win because it's not in the Nicene Creed these days. And just to make sure that everybody knew that he didn't win, they exiled him from Alexandria when he got back, and he had to live in the desert for like a decade or something. And when things like lightened up, he came back to town, but that wasn't good enough. Somebody poisoned him and then pointed out that that was God's retribution for him being a heretic. So I think that lives into Emerson's thing that, you know, being afraid of public opinion. I don't think Arius was afraid of public opinion. Then 1,200 years later, we have the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, and there was a Spaniard named Michael Servetus who grew up in a wealthy royal family and wrote a treatise and published it, because the printing press existed at that point, and went all over Europe. And his argument that was Jesus was not divine. Jesus was probably the perfect human being and someone in which we should listen to for teachings and revere, but not divine. Very much the father of Unitarianism at the time, very much a humanist. Well, Michael Servetus might have been very intellectual, but not very bright, because not only did the Roman Catholic Church, but Martin Luther and Calvin also disagreed with him. And on his way to a humanist conference in Italy, he stopped off in Geneva, Switzerland, and he thought he'd sneak in the back of Calvin's church just to hear what was going on and not be recognized. Unfortunately, Calvin recognized him and burned him at the stake. So that didn't have a happy ending either. So that's the original part of Unitarian versus Trinitarianism. But by the 19th century, we didn't have people dying anymore. We got into a movement and a period of time that we moved away from it being exclusively part of the Christian tradition and toward humanism, and then a more expansive perspective on what we stood for. So what I'm talking about here is Emerson, Thoreau, Theodore Parker, the transcendentalists of the early 19th century. At the time, Unitarianism had become one of the very, very established churches in New England, particularly in Boston. All the wealthy went to the Unitarian churches and had become very, very stuffy. Well, these were their kids. Some of them were ministers, some of them were preachers' kids, and they rebelled against it and started transcendentalism, which was not only a religious movement, but a cultural movement. It said it's the first literary cultural movement in America that broke away from we didn't need to be part of Europe. So what you heard from in the first reading that we read together essentially was Ralph Waldo Emerson's spiritual journey. As if he were up here in that pulpit today telling you, this is what I believe. This is how I've gotten to that point. And it's called the Oversoul. And there's a lot of language in there that we don't use today. But he's essentially saying it's not just the traditional God up there, people down here, heaven, hell kind of thing. He's saying that the eternal one or the divine is in all of us. And you can be in touch with that eternal one on your own. You don't have to be part of a formal church. And he particularly found it, as well as the other transcendentalists, in nature. Which today, I can see people nodding because like, yeah, what's the big deal? Back then, that was a very, very, very big deal. So to me, it's another example of people being creative thinkers and not worrying about what public opinion was. Because the transcendentalists were despised at the time. It took decades before people realized what they really were. Now, on top of it, this gets into the humanist part that they were beginning to lean towards. There was the concept that all human beings had inalienable rights, meaning it just wasn't the white rich folks in Boston or just the Christians, that everybody had human rights. And most of the transcendentalists, if not all, were very strong abolitionists, some of them even militant abolitionists. And Thoreau was actually the godfather of civil disobedience, wrote an essay on it that influenced Gandhi and later influenced Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So that's a proud heritage that we have from the 19th century, and then it manifested itself in many ways in the 20th century and now into the 21st century. A couple of key points I want to share with you. You may not know this. The 1965 march in Selma, Alabama, for civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. put out the word that clergy should join him in Selma to do this march to Montgomery. You may not know, but the highest percentage of clergy that responded were Unitarian Universalists at the time. In fact, 2 people gave their lives as part of it. James Reeb, which a church in Madison is named after him, was murdered on the sidewalk in Selma, and another woman from, a lay leader from Detroit, was actually shot in her car as she was driving back and forth, trying to shuttle people back and forth. Then after the civil rights movement, we got into the fellowship movement, which should be near and dear to my ministry because all the churches that I minister to were originally fellowships and still are. All their names still say fellowship. This was a movement in the 1950s and 60s that broke with the theology that you needed to have a member of the clergy to start a church. Lay people could do it. There's a quote from the UU World from 2008 that recapped the fellowship movement, and it said, along with growing the denomination in sheer numbers, I think it was a third or 50% of the growth that year, or those years, fellowships brought innovation, vitality, and lay leadership into the religious community greatly in need of fresh air. And I think here in Green Bay, especially with the Good Times Band, how relaxed we are with Emlyn up here, I think it's a great example of being out there and being creative. And then over time, every decade, there seemed to be another major issue that society was grappling with. And we were always in the forefront of how to think about it, how to react to it. One of them is the role of women in leadership. Now, this wasn't the late 20th century, but you should know that the Universalists ordained the very first woman in the United States in 1853. It was Olympia Brown, and she was the minister at Racine, Wisconsin, at the Universalist congregation, and that's why that congregation is now named the Olympia Brown UU Church. So that was way early, but in the 1990s, we were the first denomination where the majority of new ministers being ordained were women, the highest percentage. Now, it's followed in other more liberal Protestant denominations as well, but we were the first. And then we were always way out there in LGBTQ rights, in marriage equality, and now in talking about trans people and how we respect them and how they fit into the world. And so I want to end this part about sorry, I'm losing my thought for a second, our theology and how it's been creative over time with a quote from Reverend Tony Larson. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was at Olympia Brown Church because the new minister was being installed, and Reverend Tony Larson spoke during that service. He was there for 45 years. And he said that there is this strong interfaith involvement in Racine. He said the other clergy in town, the liberal clergy, always cherished the Unitarian Universalists because we were never shy about wrestling with the issues of the day and figuring out what to do. By the time the leaders of the other denominations and faith groups had to address it, they knew what to do because they'd already seen Reverend Larson and how the Unitarian Universalists had handled it. So to me, that's a sign of our creativity, our flexibility, and not really caring what the public opinion was at the time. But we are more than theology. That's kind of the heady stuff. I think we have a very, very creative spirituality. And spirituality isn't something we really talk a lot about. We tend to be sort of heady people, intellectual people, and spirituality seems a little bit more of the heart. So I want to talk about that for a minute today. The Oversoul, the reading that we did together, as I said, that's probably Emerson's spiritual journey. And the expressions of spirituality in our fellowships, I think, are astoundingly diverse and creative, just like what Emerson said. So I'm going to give you a few examples, actually 8. And they're mostly from people over the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, have shared publicly their journeys, but there are 2 of them where they didn't share them publicly, but they spoke with me about them, and I have their permission to share them with you. Now, I want to make sure that it's clear. These are my impressions of their spiritual journeys. This is how I've summarized what they've said publicly or to me. It's my words, not theirs. So here we go. 8 creative spiritual journey examples, and I've kind of organized them from the more traditional to the very mystic. So the first one comes from Lois Lawler at the Point Fellowship, and I would call her spiritual journey traditional and contemplative. At a remarkable young age, I think 3, she demonstrated this profound compassion for the oppressed. And she loves to tell the story about when she was in her playpen out in the yard with her little puppy dog, and boys were walking by and tossing stones into the playpen. And she was so concerned for the puppy, and she tried to help. There was a little area, like a little playhouse they could get into to save the puppy. And people have debated her, like, you couldn't have thought like that at 3 years old. But she insists that even at that young age, she was worried about the oppressed. And then she had this strong desire for a contemplative life, so much so that she sought out a monastic order at the age of 16. Very traditional Roman Catholic. She describes spending hours and hours in silent contemplation of God. What was God? How was God speaking to her? What did God want out of her life? And that led eventually as a nun to be both a teacher and an advocate for the marginalized communities, primarily in part of Colorado and then later in St. Louis. So she was a nun for a very, very long time, eventually left the order and moved to Stevens Point, and still was very, very involved in political activism. She wanted to make sure that institutions that supported her ideals, including the fellowship in Stevens Point, were going to survive and thrive. And then COVID came along. She's now 85 and for medical reasons does not want to come near COVID. So she is living in her home with her friend. They own a home together and they don't come out. They have that contemplative life again, but now they're Zoom. So she gets to talk to other people. So I would say she's returned to a contemplative life with more humanist leanings at this point. So that's Lois. Followed closely right behind is Judy Goldsmith from Open Circle. I would say she has a spiritual calling combining justice and teaching. Now, Judy Goldsmith, maybe you don't recognize that name. She had kind of two careers, a political activist and an educator. As a political activist in the early 80s, she was the president of the National Organization of Women. And now she lives in Fond du Lac. And when she arrived in Fond du Lac, she was both a teacher and an administrator. Now, we had a conversation relatively recently, and she said, Jim, you talk about spirituality. I've never been spiritual. And I think my jaw dropped on the table, and I said, you've got to be kidding me. Because let me tell you this story, and this is how I know Judy the best. Do you remember Freddie Gray's murder? He was the black man in the van, the police van, chained to it in Baltimore, and they decided to give him a rough ride around town on the way to jail, and it actually broke his neck. She was appalled by that, as was everyone. But furthermore, when she brought it up in the Fond du Lac community to some of her white friends, they didn't get why it was a big deal. And so she decided to do something about it. She had the audacity to care about Freddie Gray's murder and do something about it. And then, of course, this is Judy, an educator, so education was the answer. She wanted to eliminate ignorance and the lies about racism. She launched the Humanity Project, telling the untold story of racism in America. And then it's continuing on to this day in a virtual format that I'm a part of. And it's been, I think, almost 10 years at this point. So Judy's strong spirituality, in my opinion, is truly believing in the inherent worth and dignity of the oppressed, and then transcending complacency and cynicism that is so prevalent in our society. That's a definition of spirituality to me. Then another example from Open Circle, Jeannie and John McDowell. I think they presented at the pulpit last summer. I would describe them as being one with nature intellectually and kinesthetically. They were both teachers before they retired, and they're very nature-based and very scientific in the way they think, especially in biology. And then they've overlaid that with this love of cycling. It's their bikes are always in the lobby at Open Circle because they've ridden to church, right? And every winter now, they winter down in Arizona right near a lot of biking trails. So they're constantly out in nature. So it's not only that they know a lot about it and can talk about it and are really into native plants, but then are constantly immersed into it. So that kind of spirituality to me that comes from a more of an intellectual base has then led them to be immersed in environmentalism and preventing catastrophic failure of the ecosystem known as global warming. I think it's a spirituality that's profoundly connected to the universe, greater than ourselves. Then let's bring it home here to Green Bay, Katina Danon. I think she was last fall. She talked about her canoe trip in Maine. And I'm not sure, I call it a 21st century American transcendentalism. Essentially, she took the writings of Henry David Thoreau, who wrote The Maine Woods. He did a lot of exploring on canoe for months at a time, and then wrote about it. She took that, I would say, as a spiritual guide, and then retraced part of that canoe trip and then came back to share it with us. And I remember it was very profound listening to her talk about her connection with nature. So to me, it's a spiritual practice tied to transcendentalist principles in history, but renewed with modern sensibilities to reconnect with nature and the universe. Okay, I'm moving through the less traditional, and now we're getting into more of the mystic folks, right? Keith McGillivray, I'm sure he's on today. He knew I was going to talk about it, also from Green Bay. I think of him as mystical transcendence. If you know Keith at all, he's tied to three things: music, nature, and ancestors. It's kind of what he does and what he talks about. He readily shares drumming and flutes, his flute playing. Often in nature, you'll hear a babbling brook in the background or an echo. I think Keith sends me a recording about once a month, and I'm just always in awe of how he's so creative, and it's so beautiful. And then if you remember, I think it was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, Keith was talking about the letters that he had found, which were his father and writing to his grandmother during World War II. And so he went on to talk about the relationships in his family for generations, and they still own the farm, don't live on it anymore. But this, if you recall, there was a recording of an organ, a pump organ. His grandmother was the organist in the little town, and she'd practice on this pump organ, and that's how Keith learned music, at his grandmother's side. So to me, Keith, his purpose in life with this spirituality is to give us all the blessing of beauty in so many ways. And he reminds me constantly to think of my ancestors and tying back to them. The next one is Sam DeRoche, also from the Point Fellowship. Now, in her words, this is how she described it. Her spiritual journey is actions to contemplation to creative chaos. So if you talk to Sam, she's within a few 5 minutes or so, she'll talk about her very, very mystical experience while on a train in India when she was a young adult. And when you hear the story at first, you think, I mean, you know, I'm a father, I've had a daughter that was a young adult, and try to imagine them alone on a crowded train in India without the like expensive coach section of that train just floors me. But she tells the story and just how mystical it was for her. Eventually, this led to an exploration into a lot of meditation, but a lot of book learning. And she had a whole collection of books, mostly on Eastern religions, that she read thoroughly and really absorbed like a sponge. Spent a lot of time doing that, and suddenly the book learning and the meditation wasn't doing much for her anymore, and kind of went through a bit of a crisis. And now she's reemerging with a new spirituality. She's really leaning into the chaos of life and creatively finding spirituality along the way. And if I was going to say something about Sam, I think she's going to single-handedly love the world into a better place. It's her character. Number 7 was Tamara Ullman. Perhaps you remember, she's from Open Circle. This was probably a year and a half ago. Definitely mystical Christianity. Tamara had a really tough time as a young adult. Drugs, ended up in jail, in prison. But developed this extremely spiritual connection to Jesus, not the person Jesus, but the power of, if you think of Jesus as pure love and pure forgiveness and pure saving power, that's what she had a close spiritual connection with. And it was strong enough to pull her through the worst of times. And now that she's out, Tamara has channeled her redemption, her words, to support other formerly incarcerated women. To me, it's spirituality leading to action, and it's the inherent worth and dignity of the marginalized personified. And then finally, Sylvia Reed from Open Circle. This was probably the most recent, last winter. It's mysticism in the form of a consciousness of the universe. It's a belief that there is ultimately an order and reason for everything. She would describe it as a divine order. And it's kind of this evolving thing. She would say, everything evolves towards harmony and pure love over the infinity of space and time. And as a result of this calling and these beliefs, Sylvia is immersed in Fond du Lac in ways to help others, particularly at the Fondy Food Pantry. So, those are my 8 examples. I think we are indeed a people of creativity. What amazing creativity. And that's only 8 of them, right? If you add the membership of all three fellowships, we're about 130 members. I would argue that there's probably about 20 friends that regularly come and visit us. So there's probably 150 individual spiritual journeys out there that are each creatively different from the other. But there are two things I think that they have in common. I think every single one of us is driven by an optimistic view of the world. We will not succumb to the cynicism that's out there that's beating us up every day, all the time. We still believe in the optimism of the world, and that we can lead into some sort of action. We're a people of action, some way to convert this optimism into making the world better. And we do that through, I think, our spiritual paths, our spiritual journeys. So again, if you think back to Emerson, I think that's what he was trying to tell us in his Oversoul writings, that was his spiritual path. And don't be afraid of what other people think about it, and don't be complacent in your own rut. Go out there and get creative. So all of this creative theology, creative spirituality, I realize is kind of heavy and kind of deep. So I want to leave you with a bit of whimsy for your contemplation. Ran across an article in the New York Times last month. It's an opinion article by Charles Blow. And it was titled, "I Want to Be the Old Man with Orange Socks." And it starts out this way. "I believe that the ways we construct our visual environments, including the ways we present ourselves in the world, are reflections of ourselves. And insisting on bringing beauty into lives that can sometimes feel like an unremitting series of horrors is the only way some of us can survive." Now, Blow grew up in a poor African-American family in Louisiana, and he has fond memories of small moments of creativity purely for pleasure's sake, even though they were so poor. For example, he highlights that his grandmother had this tiny little house, but insisted that it be painted daffodil yellow, and she had all these old tires in the yard that she had bountiful flower gardens in every single one of them. And then Blow noticed that, in his culture, all the women wore church hats to church, right? But he noticed that his grandmother, as she aged and grew older, her hats got bigger and bigger at the same time. And then he said his mother sewed all of her own clothes so she could save money so the children could have store-bought clothes. But she just didn't make some frock because you have to wear clothes. He has memories of her poring over patterns and picking out just the right one and feeling bolts of fabric and then thinking carefully about the buttons and the bric-a-brac that she was going to use. And he said it wasn't because she was trying to be fashionable. She was trying to think of her personality and how she wanted to present herself to the world, and was very careful about what beauty she picked out. Back to a quote. He says, "It was in that poverty that I first saw how beauty and pride of appearance were used as ways of conveying dignity in a world intent on divesting you of it." So today, Blow embraces creativity as a way to express his freedom. Freedom in thinking, freedom in working, freedom in loving, freedom in living. He sounds like a Unitarian Universalist. And so he said that's why he finds old men in orange socks and quirky suspenders so endearing when they retire. It's a way of being emancipated from the father, husband, worker roles that they held for so long. And he didn't leave women out. He said, have you noticed that older women tend to often, when they want to dress up, wear every bracelet that they own all at the same time? He said, it's this creative spark we had as children when we played dress up. It's putting positivity out into the world. It's a way of saying, I've survived and I am going to celebrate. So I think, frankly, and I had to chuckle when I read this, Unitarian Universalists are like old men wearing orange socks. We are sending positive energy and spirituality out into the world that needs it desperately. We should be very, very proud of our heritage and continue on with our undeterred optimism. The world may not know what to make of us in our quirky ways, and that's just fine. They need our creative positivity to survive. So that actually is the discussion question today. And I want you to ponder it for yourself. And if you feel like sharing it during the coffee hour with others or on the way home, please do. So how does your creativity, spiritual or otherwise, positively impact the world around you? Let me do it again. How does your creativity, spiritual or otherwise, positively impact the world around you? So may that creativity always continue and be a blessing to the world. And I would like to take a moment of silence to let it sink in for a minute before I do my final amen, okay? Amen and blessed be.